Good day, class. Let's go ahead and start with our review of key topics for unit number 1. Okay, we'll be covering chapters 1 key topics, appendix A, and chapter 2. Please note that the exam for this particular unit, our first unit of this particular course, will be Monday, August 24th by 11:59 p.m. So it's already open, but you'll have at least until Monday, August 24th, 11:59 p.m. to complete this assessment. So let's move on here. So first, let's talk about one of the key things that we started off with in chapter 1, factors in the scientific attitudes. The idea is that all scientists share to some varying degrees certain attitude about how it is they conduct science. First of all, most scientists and researchers are going to be very curious. So curiosity is a major component of this particular attitude. Along with curiosity, a desire to know things and figure things out, is skepticism. Along with skepticism, we have humility. So what we mean by skepticism is that you are skeptical of information being provided to you. When someone tells you something, you don't accept it totally at face value. What you try to do is try to find out what rationale and what evidence supports this statement that this person made. So curiosity, skepticism, key components to the scientific attitude. The other idea deals with humility. Now, everybody likes to be correct and to be right, but the truth of the matter is that we're not always correct and we're not always right. Humility is the idea that researchers, scientists understand that many times, or at least sometimes, their ideas, their theories, their hypotheses will not turn out as they had hoped or had expected. So they know that they can be wrong. So the idea that we want to emphasize here is that in order to have a true scientific attitude, it will involve these three factors of curiosity, skepticism, and humility. The other key item that we covered in that first chapter deals with critical thinking. Critical thinking, of course, is very strongly supported by the idea of the scientific attitude. But critical thinking does not blindly accept arguments and conclusions. We don't allow people just to tell us the way things are. We need to find evidence for it. So, in critical thinking, it examines assumptions. Do we have the proper assumptions or do we have faulty assumptions? It appraises the source. The person that's telling us this information, do they have ulterior motives or certain biases that we need to be aware of? It discerns hidden biases. Is this person prejudiced or biased against a certain type of business or a certain type of government? We evaluate the evidence that's been presented to us. Is this from a legitimate source? Is this something that we can trust? And it also will assess what the conclusions are. Does these conclusions that we have here make sense? So critical thinking is not only a key thing that we want to try to communicate to you that we all should have, but it's also, in a way, a goal of this particular course to help you to become better critical thinkers by the time you complete this course. When someone presents you with information, you know what to ask yourself. You know the things to look out for. That's going to be a key thing that we hopefully will be able to accomplish as we finish this course. Now, let's look a little bit at the schools of psychology, the schools of thought of psychology. In chapter 1, we talked about a variety of things. We talked about the historical foundations of psychology, from structuralism to functionalism, okay? And then we started focusing on the major movements in psychology, of which behaviorism was one. There'll be a whole another chapter on this a little bit later that will focus on behavioristic ideas. So behavior, scientifically defined, conditioned, observed, and measured. The focus of behaviorists was the following. They believed strongly that for psychology to be a science, it needed to be something that was quite objective, something that we could count, that we could see, that one person could see it and count it, and another person could see it and count it at the same time. Now, unlike other early psychology areas and schools of thought, like structuralism, they used introspection. And we couldn't have anybody objectively look at someone's thought process or what they consciously experience. We didn't have that ability. So, from a hardcore behaviorist point of view, they would think that the introspective tool of the structuralists was something that should not be even in psychology at all because it's not scientific. So the key thing here is to understand that behaviorism was a major movement in America, and it was a wave of popularity, and a lot of people focusing on the behavioristic ideas. But it was something that was uniquely its own thing. You had John Watson, Ivan Pavlov, who started this whole thing with conditioned response, but John Watson and later B.F. Skinner, they really popularized the behavioristic movement and something that had a long-lasting effect in America. Now, that opens us up to some of the subfields of psychology. Now, a couple of things I want to talk about real quickly here. Psychology has at its root research. Research is the beginning of lots of things in psychology. It's going to be founded in research. Now, one of the key things that we want to communicate is that there are two basic ways in which we look at research and conduct it. We have basic research, which is a pure science that aims to increase scientific knowledge base. They're not trying to solve a particular problem. What they're trying to do is just to learn about psychology, learn about mental processes, or learn about behavior and the conditions in which these things happen, and so on. That's the whole point. They are going to be most likely associated with a think tank or a university or something of that nature. Then we have applied research. This is the scientific study that aims to solve a practical problem. So we have a problem, and we want to use our psychological knowledge and our research techniques and methodologies to try to figure out a solution to this problem. And one very valuable thing is that when we do this research, it's a way of testing our ideas. We don't want to spend millions upon millions of dollars on something that does not work. So by doing the applied research and doing the research itself, we have greater confidence that yes, this addresses the problem that we have here, and it seems to be quite legitimate, and we can spend money on it now, as opposed to trying some idea out and spending millions of dollars and the research wasn't done, and we find out we've wasted our money. So that is the research perspective of the subfields of psychology. Now, there's a more professional aspect to it as well. We have counseling psychologists, branch of psychology that assist people with problems in living and in achieving greater well-being. So here we see clients who may not have a lot of hard issues or particular problems. They're just trying to live life better. Okay, clinical psychologists will probably deal more with people who have specific type of psychological disorders and particular issues. So we see that there's a little bit more intense when it comes to clinical psychologists. Psychiatry, very similar to clinical psychologists, but one major big difference, and that is that psychiatry is a field within medicine, the medicine discipline. So it's a branch of medicine dealing with psychological disorders practiced by MDs or physicians who have this additional training in the psychological area. This allows these psychiatrists to be able to prescribe medicines. And then we have community psychology, a branch of psychology that studies how people interact with their social environments and how social institutions affect individuals and groups. So we can see a variety of different types of fields in which one can get involved in psychology. So the next thing we talk about in chapter 1 that I think is a key idea is this concept of operational definition. An operational definition is something that's very, very important to the ideas of research, which we'll be talking about next. But operational definition is a carefully worded statement of the exact procedures, the operations used in a research study. One of the things, too, which may help to explain it is this. If we were doing some sort of study on, let's say, aggressiveness, okay, and we would have a definition of aggressiveness. And you can look up what a definition of aggressiveness would be. But the point is not necessarily that theoretical definition of aggressiveness, but something that is concrete. So if we're going to do an experiment and we're going to be measuring aggressiveness in somehow, we need to make it concrete and make it real. So we could have a survey that could ask a bunch of questions about your aggressive tendencies. Do you hit? Do you scream? And all this type of stuff. Or if you wanted to see, and the study that we'll be talking about a little bit later, want to see if kids, after going through a certain scenario, tend to be more aggressive when other kids did not go through a certain scenario. We have to define operationally what aggressiveness is. And in this example, we would say it's how many times a kid screams or hits or punches or kicks. And we just count how many times that happens. That would be very concrete. That is also an operational definition. Now, that takes us to this other key idea that we saw in chapter 1, research methods. Okay? With research methods, it's how we employ ways and methods in order to answer questions about the world around us. We talk about a correlation, a measure of the extent to which two factors vary together, how well the factors predict each other. A correlation, by the way, does not prove causation. So a correlation, as we talked about previously, is saying we're looking at two variables. We want to see how they relate to one another. As one variable goes up, the other variable may go up too, or it may go down. If both variables are going in the same direction, as one goes up, it goes up. As one goes down, it goes down. It's a positive correlation. But if they have the opposite direction, as one goes up, the other one goes down, and then the one that went up now goes down, the other one then goes up, that is a negative correlation. So the idea of correlation is just trying to ascertain how two variables are related to one another. Then we have case study. A case study one entity or person or a very limited number of individuals. It may suggest fruitful ideas for future research. We can't journalize the results, but it can not tell us anything universal about what we find. Because we study one person, and this person has a unique characteristic, that's why we're interested in studying this person. We know about that one person, but one person is just not a large enough sample size for us to say that if something else happened to another individual in similar circumstances, that they're going to wind up the same way as the person that we study. We just don't have enough evidence for that. But it can give us ideas of what future research we might want to do. Then we have naturalistic observation. Describes and sometimes illuminates, but does not explain behavior. So we go out into the, quote, natural environment, and we observe people in their natural habitat, so to speak. And we just are looking for a good description or the frequency count of certain types of behaviors that we are interested in. This can build us a case. These things are very descriptive. They describe the phenomena that we may be interested in, but it doesn't tell us that much more. In addition, we have the survey. The survey describes and sometimes illuminates, but does not explain behavior either. It's just asking questions of a group of people with the idea that when we get those responses, we can hopefully journalize that result to a larger population. You'll be seeing that in a political season as we're getting into election year here, is that when they survey, let's say around 1,500 people around the country of a certain characteristics these people possess, and then we get the responses from the survey items, we then can, to some degree, confidently say the larger hundreds of millions of us who fit that particular profile will think of things in this way. And we'll see that quite often over the next few weeks and months as they do political surveys. Now, part of the survey involves making sure that we have random samples, a sample that fairly represents a population because each member has an equal chance of inclusion. And we'll see more about that too when we get to experimentation. The population are all those in a group being studied from which samples may be drawn. So you'll hear terms like of likely voters. We first surveyed 1,500 likely voters, and this is what they said about this. Now, the likely voters are a representative sample, in a sense, of people who are likely to vote. The population who is likely to vote, we sample that population, and then we find out what they're thinking and how they say they're going to behave when they get into the election booth, the voting booth. Now, the previous research methodologies take us by giving us a little bit of a description and how variables are associated with one another, but they can't tell us anything about causation. That is the area to which experiment really focuses on. A research method in which an investigator manipulates one or more factors. The factor they manipulate would be called the independent variable. They vary that to observe the effect on some behavior or mental process, the dependent variable. So the dependent variable literally depends upon what happened to the independent variable. That's the process there, the belief there. So by random assignment of participants, the experimenter aims to control other relevant factors. One of the key ideas of an experiment is about control. You want to control as many things as possible, as you possibly can. And then you're going to vary one thing or very few things, but you're going to have control over it. You're going to vary this one thing. And then you're going to measure something that you believe will be influenced by that thing that you varied. And that way, when you find the results out, and the results suggest that there was a difference depending on what thing you manipulated, then you can start to suggest strongly that there was causation at play. So we have a couple of ideas here. We have the experimental group in an experiment, the group exposed to the treatment, that is, to one version of the independent variable. Then we have the control group in an experiment, the group that does not that is not exposed to the treatment, contrasts with the experimental group and serves as a comparison for evaluating the effect of the treatment. So one group gets the treatment, one group does not get the treatment. Then you look at the results, the dependent variable. Do they differ? If they differ, then you have something there. All right? And then with random assignment, as we just talked about, we assign participants to either the experimental or control groups by chance, thereby minimizing any type of pre-existing differences between the groups. If you truly randomly assign from a population individuals to one of these two groups, experimental or control group, that makes it almost sound like magic. But what happens is that control group and that experimental group are equivalent to each other. So the characteristics of one group are going to be the same type of characteristics to the other group. So that's one way in which we control as many things as we possibly can in an experiment. Now let's talk about a classic experiment that I do believe was mentioned in the first chapter. This is the Bandura study, or the Bobo doll study. A study conducted to investigate social behaviors like aggression can be acquired by observation and imitation. The basic premise is that when young kids in particular see someone behave in a certain way, they can learn that behavior. So in this example, we have a population of nursery school age children. Then we randomly assign two groups, the control group and the experimental group. Then we show to the control group a video of just an adult in a room with a Bobo doll acting totally non-aggressively, not doing anything to the Bobo doll. All right? So they're not getting the aggressive role model treatment. But the experimental group is getting the aggressive role model treatment. What happens here is that the role model here, the adult, will beat Bobo doll up. Hit, kick, whatever the case may be. So what we see in this example, the control group gets a non-aggressive model, and the experimental group gets an aggressive model. So this is the independent variable, whether or not they get the aggressive model or the non-aggressive model. The dependent variable is what they want to measure, the thing they think has an effect. So they think what model they saw, non-aggressive or aggressive, will have an impact on when they put the child in a room with the Bobo doll by themselves, will the child demonstrate aggressive behavior? And we operationally define aggressive behavior here by the number of hits. So how many times do they hit Bobodol. So when all is said and done, and they've done the studies and run all the conditions here, what we'll be able to see is count the number of times the children from the control group hit Bobodol, and the number of times the children from the aggressive model, the experimental condition group, hit the Bobodol. And normally what we see is that the kids who saw the aggressive model will indeed be more aggressive toward the Bobodol. So that gives us a really quick rundown about research methods and things of that nature. Another key thing that we talked about in chapter 1 deals with ethics. There are so many ethical rules with regard to how clinical psychologists must behave in relationship to their relation to their patient or client. There's also rules about any type of professional psychologist in relation to a particular client, so that we don't get confusion and take advantage of people. But when it comes to experimentation, the ethical guidelines are very straightforward as well. First, we obtain potential participants' informed consent to take part. When they're going to take part in an experiment, before they agree, the participants agree to take part in an experiment, they must be informed about what the experiment is about in general terms, what is the potential danger to them specifically, and so that they have informed consent when they agree to participate in a study. And of course, we know this is a very sensitive thing. I'm sure you're aware of many studies out there that have been done that have been somewhat ethically challenged, where medical professionals or psychologists a long time ago performed type of experiments or research studies that had some ethical concerns tied to it. All right, so we also must protect participants from greater than usual harm and discomfort. That means one of the driving factors for our ethical guidelines here is that we need to make sure that we're not putting our participants in any harm that would be greater than just a normal day harm that may happen. We try to avoid that at all possibilities. We're trying to eliminate discomfort more than would be normal or usual. And we also need to keep information about the individual participants confidential. A lot of research studies that are done are very sensitive. They focus on very sensitive topics. In order to avoid having issues of this data getting out, we need to make sure that the data is maintained in a very secure manner. And then we need to fully debrief people. We explain the research afterward, including any temporary deception. Now, in some instances, particularly in social psychology, we sometimes will give a cover story to the possible participants for one of our research studies. We give them this cover story because we told them exactly what we were planning on doing and what we were looking for, they may change or alter their behavior. So we may sometimes use deception at the beginning of the experiment, but we give them enough information so they know what the harm level is and all that type of stuff. But we can deceive them somewhat. But one of the key factors for that debrief is to tell them, yes, we did deceive you. This is why we used deception, and this is what we were looking for, and then you explain everything very, very thoroughly. That's what we are hoping to be able to accomplish. Now, then we move on to Appendix A, where we touch base with a little bit of statistics here. Just want to go over a few of the key items here. The median. We have that median in the highway. It just divides the road. This is just the middle number. So when you rank the numbers from low to high, you just select the middle number. If there is no middle number, let's say it's an even group of numbers, you take them and then you average it, and that gives you your median. Then we have the mode, the most frequently occurring score, okay, or scores. We have the mean, the one that you're probably most familiar with, the average, the total sum of all the scores divided by the number of scores. And then we have the range of scores. The gap between the lowest and the highest provides only a crude estimate of variation. So we have the modes of central tendency, the mean, mode, and median. And then we have variation. the range, the crudest measure, and then the standard deviation. It better gauges whether scores are packed together or dispersed because it uses information from each score. Then we move on to chapter 2. The structure of the neurons. Neuron, a nerve cell, the basic building block of the nervous system. The idea is that this neuron is the fundamental item that helps us to build the complete nervous system here. The cell body of that neuron contains the nucleus and the life support centers of the cell. So it keeps the neuron alive, so to speak. We have the dendrites. The neurons are often bushy, branching extensions that receive and integrate messages, conducting impulses toward the cell body. After the cell body, we then have the axon, the neuron extension that passes messages through its branches all the way to the terminal buttons at the end, where it contains those vesicles that contain the neurotransmitters that will then be released to travel across the synaptic gap. The myelin sheath, the fatty tissue layer segmentally encasing the axons of some of the neurons, enables vastly greater transmission speeds. The glial cells, cells in the nervous system that support, nourish, and protect neurons, action potential is this electricity, this neural impulse, a brief electrical charge that travels down an axon. Now, the factors involved in this neural impulse. We have this electricity is generated from this chemical events. As it was communicated in the videos that you hopefully observed and watched and took notes on, we have these ions, these charged particles, these charged ions, that when there's enough stimulation, okay, there's going to be an exchange of these ions. So enough stimulation of our neuron, the membrane's electrical charge reaches a threshold, which then will prompt the neurons to fire an impulse or an action potential that travels down like a wave down the axon, sends a message to other neurons, muscles, or glands that transmits either an inhibitory or an excitatory signals. Okay, turn on, turn off, basically. And then after that does happen, we have this refractory period where the neuron is unresponsive to stimulation. So a certain amount of time must pass before it can receive new messages. And the other key concept here is this all or none response. The basic premise there is that in an all or none response, it fires the same way every single time. It doesn't have the ability to overfire or underfire. It's always the same way. It's an all or none response. It's similar, not to be crude here, but similar to the idea that you can't be half pregnant. You're either pregnant or not pregnant. So here it's either fires or it doesn't fire. There's no half-seas or overcharging involved here. Now, these neurotransmitters, okay, so we have the electrical charge traveling down the axon, goes to the terminal branches at the very end, it releases the neurotransmitter. And there are a whole variety of neurotransmitters. We talked about that in the previous lecture. But again, I want to focus on a couple here. Serotonin, which affects mood, hunger, sleep, and arousal. We focus primarily and use serotonin quite a bit, or control serotonin for its effect on our mood. So we want to enhance the amount of serotonin in the brain, make it active for longer periods of time so people are less depressed. Then we have endorphins. Again, endorphins is very much like morphine. It's basically our body's own production drug for pain relief and pleasure. So when we have endorphins in our body, that usually means that we have been injured and endorphins are released. Or it may mean that we have done something like a lot of exercise or been very, very active and retired and sweaty. Endorphins may be released as well. So endorphins can be released to help us deal with pain or be released to give us pleasure after we've done a lot of physical activity. It's almost like a reward for us. Then we have the endocrine system and its glands. Real quickly, we have the endocrine system. Very much like the nervous system. The nervous system is about communication. Okay, that's what the nervous system is doing. It's about communication and sending orders back and forth. But the endocrine system is also about communication, but it's much slower than the nervous system. So it is the body's slow chemical communication system. These hormones is what's been released in the blood. These are chemical messengers that are manufactured by the endocrine glands, and they travel through the bloodstream to affect other tissues. The hormones and the neurotransmitters have a great deal of similarity, so they're very similar to one another. The adrenal glands are a pair of endocrine glands that sit just above the kidneys and secrete hormones of epinephrine and norepinephrine. We have the pituitary gland, the endocrine system's most influential gland, under the influence of the hypothalamus. The pituitary regulates growth and controls other endocrine glands. It's sort of like the master gland. Then we talk about the brain, the structures of the brain in particular. So what we've done in chapter 2, we've started off by talking about the building blocks of the nervous system. Then we talked about which is the neurons, and then we talked about the endocrine glands, and now we talk about the structure of the brain. We start off by looking at the early brain, or the old brain. We start off with the brain stem, okay? The oldest part of the central core of the brain, beginning where the spinal cord swells as it enters the skull. The brain stem is responsible for automatic survival functions. We have the medulla, base of the brainstem. It controls heartbeat and breathing. The thalamus, the brain's sensory control center, located on the top of the brainstem. It directs messages to the sensory receiving areas and the cortex and transmits replies to the cerebellum and medulla. We have the cerebellum, processes sensory input, coordinates voluntary movement, output, and balance, and enables nonverbal learning and memory. The reticular formation, nerve network that travels through the brainstem into the thalamus and plays an important role in the movement, output, and balance, enabling nonverbal learning and memory. The limbic system, neural system including the amygdala, hypothalamus, and so on. Located below the cerebral hemisphere, is associated with emotions and drives. The amygdala is associated with emotion. The hypothalamus is going to be associated with maintenance activities such as eating, drinking, body temperature. The hippocampus, neural center located in the limbic system, helps process explicit or conscious memories of facts and events for storage. Now, the cerebral cortex is the new brain. This is the brain that's all wrinkly, the one that we normally think of when we think brain. The ultimate control and information processing center of body. We see it's divided up into the left and right hemispheres. We have 4 lobes. The frontal lobes, portions of the cerebral cortex lying just behind the forehead, involved in speaking and muscle movements and making plans and judgments. The parietal lobe, portion of the cerebral cortex lying at the top of the head and toward the rear, receives sensory input for touch and body position. The occipital lobes, portion of the cerebral cortex lying at the back of the head, includes areas that receive information from the visual fields. And temporal lobes, portion of the cerebral cortex lying roughly above the ears, including the auditory areas, each of which receives information primarily from the opposite ear. And then finally, we have this idea of role of association areas. So we see this notion of all the areas of the brain that have certain primary functions. So association areas are the cerebral cortex areas not involved in primary motor or sensory functions. So the belief here was at one point that these areas of the brain were not doing anything. And that probably led people to believe the following, that we only use 10% of our brain, our brain's capacity, which is not a true statement at all. So our mental experiences arise from coordinated brain activity. In reality, the 10% claim is 100% myth. You use all of your brain. The only instances where there are unused regions of the brain are those in which brain damage or disease has destroyed certain regions. The idea is that although we know there are certain specific areas of the brain that tend to be associated with certain types of functions, we use the rest of our brain to help process information. So it is like having additional space to crunch numbers, to crunch scenes, and come up with ideas. So it is used quite a bit. So the idea is that we have learned quite a bit about what's going on, but there's still so much more to learn about the brain, and more importantly, the mind, and how the mind actually works, where does consciousness come from, and those types of things there. So that covers, for the most part, all the items that I think are going to be really key to the key concepts and key topic areas for this first unit that we've just finished. Your exam will cover many of these topics and areas that we just covered in this presentation.